Hi there, Steve Kaufman here. I'm back in Palm Springs for another few months. Avoid the rain in Vancouver. The last video I did, I'm trying to address these problems that people identified in different languages. The first one was on the subjunctive in French. And today I'm going to talk a bit about phrasal verbs because that came up quite often from learners of English. And so obviously I'm not, as I said with the subjunctive, I'm not a teacher. I'm also not a teacher of English, but I'm not even a learner of English. So I'm not entirely sure of the nature of the difficulty that people feel with phrasal verbs. But I had a look at phrasal verbs. Now, the first thing that strikes me is that most phrasal verbs revolve around the most common verbs in the language. Get, give, come, go, and so forth. So, and I've often felt this, that, trying to learn the most common words in the language is kind of difficult because, some people are interested in the names of fruits and vegetables, and other people are interested in more complicated, this thing fell down, interest, education, balancing the budget. So the nouns depend more on your area of interest, but the verbs tend to be more or less common. So to try and learn the most common verbs, you can easily Google and find the 100 most common verbs in English. Those you should really know, all right? And anytime you see them, if you're working at Link, you want to save those and really understand how those verbs are used. In English, it's not so much a matter of how they change, as in Romance languages or some other languages. It's more a matter of how they're used and which words they are used together with. And that's why it's so important, for example, at Link. And I'm going to refer to Link because that's how I learn languages. But you can the idea is the same, whether you're using Link or not. When you see a verb in English, particularly a common verb, underline as much of the phrase that includes that verb as possible. Now, in Link, we have the opportunity to say, first of all, if you save a word, you will save a chunk. Automatically, the system saves a chunk. And when you look at that word that you've saved, say this verb, you'll see 5 or 6 or 7 examples of that verb being used, and you'll see which words it is used with. So the idea of phrasal verbs is that it's true not only for verbs, but certain verbs are used together with certain other words, typically with prepositions. Sometimes that changes the meaning or gives it different meaning. For example, I know a lot of non-native speakers of English will often say, I found out a book at the library instead of I found a book at the library. Okay, and the word find out means more to discover, whereas to find is to come across something. Come across, there's another phrasal verb. Come, very common verb. You come by something, you come across something, you come at something, so that the preposition behind the verb will sort of give a different nuance and sometimes a completely different meaning to the verb. So you have to learn that combination as a different term almost, but you have to begin by being conscious of which words are used together with other words, and in particular with verbs. So one of the things that I have done for learning other languages, like Slavic languages, is to tag the words that I save. So if you are learning English at Link, you tag every verb that you feel is involved in phrasal verbs. Before we get into that, let me say that because a lot of our members at Link are saving phrases, it is very likely that if you come across, it's almost certain that if you come across a verb that's used in a longer phrase, a common longer phrase, somebody will have saved that as a phrase. So you can see the list of phrases that have been saved by other users, and you can choose one of them and save it to your database. So you can actually save either verbs that are commonly used in phrasal verbs or the phrases to your database. Then you can tag them. You can tag them as phrasal verbs. So just for the fun of it, I went and tagged a bunch of verbs that are commonly used in phrasal verbs. So you have turn, okay? So if I look at turn and I open that, I see that the samples turn, in turn, okay, here's one, in turn, which isn't quite a phrasal verb. Turn those three things into, turn something into. Turn it into, practical example, turn on the TV. So those are here again, or turn about and travel. So just by saving the word turn, I pick up automatically 6 phrases using the word turn. Or if I know, I also chose know as a phrasal verb. In other words, a verb that gets involved in phrasal verbs. You can also save, the past tense knew, but most of us know that being, know their limits. I know my, okay, know well. So this one is less useful. Let's take, for example, give. Give it to them, give it back, give it away. So give us a clue. So, I could go on and on here. Get, which is a big one in phrasal verbs. Get to a modicum, get it in front of, get encouraged, get to sleep, get back. So what I'm suggesting here is, in order to get better at phrasal verbs, you have to be exposed to them. So you have to pay attention when you're reading and listening. If you hear a phrasal verb, in other words, a phrase using a certain verb, you have to get used to the way that verb and certain other words function together as a unit. So you have to pay attention. So one way of doing it is you tag a bunch of these, say at link, and then you review them as a group. All right? So the other thing is, getting back to find out, if I were a non-native speaker, I would get to where I can understand the phrasal verbs as much as possible, but I would avoid using them because there's a chance I'll get them wrong. So rather than saying find out, I would use discover. And generally speaking, phrasal verbs are less formal than what is often their Latin origin equivalent. And so in formal writing, it's in fact often better not to use the phrasal verb. So I would treat phrasal verbs not as some great big exceptional thing. It's simply an example of the rule that in any language there is a tendency for certain words to be used together with other words. This is sometimes referred to as collocations, which is again a difficult term we needn't learn. We just need to know that certain words are used with other words, and that the more naturally you put these words together, the more the way you put words together is typical of how words are used, the more native-like you're going to sound. Therefore, you should save words, or phrases. You should focus on phrases. When you save a word, you should pay attention to which words are used with that word, and that will help you not only on phrasal verbs per se, but even such things as, listen to. So many times you hear the non-native speaker say, I listen him, whereas I listen to him, okay? You can tell him, but you can't listen him. You have to listen to him. So that it's not just phrasal verbs. It's the idea of which verbs take which prepositions, which verbs are used with other words, and that's something that should be a major part of your language learning. And again, not only for English, but for any language. Focus in on which words are used with which other words, and that will make you, a more natural speaker of the language, because you can't just get a book of all the key phrasal verbs and read through the book and hope that somehow you'll remember them. You have to develop habits through your listening and reading so that you naturally start to use these words correctly. So I hope that's useful. And because I'm not a learner of English, I would like to know if in fact that is useful, and maybe some people could tell me what specifically they find difficult about phrasal verbs. All right, thanks for listening. Bye for now.